have worked on a lot of change projects and programs over the years. And I felt that there was a real opportunity to do something to bring together projects and comms. So I think, you know, the book is partly about helping project managers and people working on projects to understand what good communication looks like, but also to help some of us as communicators who find ourselves suddenly on this strange beast called a project, to understand a bit about what a project is and why actually change comms and project comms is perhaps a little bit different to what we do every day as business as usual. And then I felt it needed a bit of an update because, you know, when I wrote the first one, I actually can't remember when that was. I think it might have been 2013. Nobody really talked about agile. In fact, nobody even talked about waterfall, which is kind of, you know, the other kind of way to approach running a project. It was just project management. But then this strange beast of agile has become more to the fore. And so I felt it was important to give the book a bit of a refresh. And also just things like, you know, the tools that we use, etc., have moved on and changed over the years. And it's quite interesting actually to look back and realize just how much things have changed in terms of, you know, the channels, etc., that are available to us as communicators. I've also contributed a chapter in Kevin Ruck's book. So many of you might know Kevin. So Kevin Ruck, he's also my husband. So obviously, you know, I had to give his book a shout out. But I've got a chapter in there as well about project management. Because I think as internal communicators, very often we come up against a project or we become part of a project. Because if there's change happening in our organisations, then it should be being underpinned by a project. So I think it's really helpful that we understand, you know, what projects are, you know, the importance of them. And also I would add, you know, we can perhaps borrow ourselves some of those project techniques and tools for our own work, because I'm a great believer in project management. I'm slightly obsessive about it because I just think it helps us to work so much more efficiently and cleanly, have more focus, and to know what we're doing. So I'm a big fan of project management myself, and I get a bit involved with the Association for Project Management, which is like the CIPR for the project world. So they're also a chartered body, and kind of on a similar journey as the CIPR to professionalise project management and get people to understand more about the benefits that projects can have, you know, to organisations and you know, to life in general, really. So when I wasn't writing that, I run PR Academy along with my husband Kevin Ruck, where we do a lot of the CIPR qualifications, internal comms certificate, internal comms diploma. So I'll know a few of you from there. Okay, so my first thing about project communication is that it's not a soft skill. And I don't know if any of you will ever have heard people on your projects or programs or just in your organisations saying that communication's a bit like HR or whatever, it's a soft skill. And it's a small point, but it's a big point too. If ever we hear people say that, we should stop them and pull them up on it. In fact, we could bop them over a head with a copy of my book and say, no, communication is not a soft skill. I could argue that actually building an IT system is the easy part. It's the communication, it's the change, it's getting people on board with new systems and processes and doing that well that actually is really, really difficult. So communication is not a soft skill. We're doing what we do based on research, evidence, objective setting, measurement, all that good stuff. So that's my first message, and it's one to take back to your projects and just pull people up on, because I think, you know, we really do need our projects to take us seriously as communicators. And sometimes I think this idea of it being a soft skill stops that happening. So I'm going to talk a bit today about the sort of three elements that I think all need to work together for successful communication on a project. And that is the project itself, it's the change management piece, and it's the communication piece. And one day when I can have some time, I'm going to actually develop some whizzy model that brings those all together a little bit more effectively. But I think sometimes when we're supporting a project, if we're struggling a bit to find out what on earth's going on and why has that happened and who's doing this and all the rest of it, it quite possibly is because there isn't the change management piece in place, or actually the project isn't perhaps being run as well as it could be, or we've not been involved as much as we should be in the day-to-day running of that project. So I think for successful project communications, regardless of whether it's waterfall, agile, or a bit of both, it's about understanding these three different elements and how they all work together. Now, if there isn't change management in place, well, that isn't always going to be the case. Not every project particularly warrants it. But this is perhaps where, as communicators, we can benefit from having a bit of understanding of some of the change management principles. Now, I won't go into masses of detail about it today, obviously, because we've only got an hour in total. I do want to leave as much time as possible for a good old chat and some questions, but it might be something to think about going away and doing a bit of learning about as well. So, first of all, 101, let's go right back to basics. What is a project? And I know this sounds really obvious, but actually it is quite important, in our organisations to understand what a project is, and when the organisation really needs to kind of convene a project, and when actually what you've got on your hands is business as usual. Because a project brings with it all those sort of, good governance and processes and all that kind of thing that makes sure that, the organisation is making best use of its money, that it can understand perhaps at a higher level when you start to talk about something called portfolio management, which is all your projects and your programmes and a bit of business as usual all wrapped up together, which enables the organisation to have a bit of a picture of the amount of change that's going on and whether all that change is really delivering for the organisation. So a project then, this is the definition from the Association for Project Management. It's a unique transient endeavour to achieve a desired outcome. And I just wanted to pick out one word in particular there. A project is unique. Every project we do is unique. Now, it might have been done before. So if we just think about our own sort of world as internal communicators, we might have run this town hall event before, or the senior exec roadshow, or whatever it is. But every time we do it, something will be different. You might have a different budget, you might have a different team, you might have a different CEO. And that's why, every project we need to remember is unique, and we need to approach them with that in mind. We can't always just pick up and do exactly what we've done before. They're transient, obviously. Projects have a beginning and an end. That's why I quite like them. I quite like that pace and the fact that it will end and you'll go on to something else. I really enjoy that. And it's all about an outcome. Something will be different at the end to the situation when we started our project. So we often hear now, as I said, people talk about waterfall and agile. So this is an opportunity for me to introduce one of my holiday pictures to the presentation. So what do we mean when we're talking about waterfall and agile? Well, essentially, they're two different ways to run a project. I personally, this is just my personal view, and I'll be really interested later on to hear what you think, but I sometimes think, it can be easy to get a little bit overexcited about agile and think it's the new best shiny thing, and it's also much better than running a project in a waterfall way. But actually, you dig into it, an awful lot of the principles and stuff around agile you can do in a waterfall environment as well, I think, if it's well run. So I'll be interested to see what people think about that. So what do we mean by waterfall? Well, I'm not sure why we call it waterfall. I think it's probably because of this. This is my sort of standard diagram of what a waterfall project looks like. The organisation has an objective and decides it's going to do something, there's a feasibility study, and then it goes into production. And that's your project, typical project life cycle. It's all developed, produced, thrown over into business as usual. And if at some point in the future you want to upgrade it or do it again, you might kick off another project. So it simply kind of looks a bit like a waterfall. So I don't personally know why I didn't call it a staircase, but I can only think that's the reason why we call it waterfall. So how does that differ when we're talking about agile? And I think it's worth just pausing here, because I think during COVID, the word agile got used quite, it got used a lot, and it got used to mean lots of different things. So just the idea of having to be what I might call fleet of foot and be able to sort of pivot and do things differently. We gave that activity, that behavior, the badge of agile, and indeed it was. But agile also means, a way of running a project. And the difference really is, if you think back to the other my other rather rubbish diagram, which I apologise, but with a waterfall project, you're kind of developing everything together, and then you hand it over into business as usual. It's all done and off you go. Whereas with an agile project, you break up this into what gets called sprints. So you break down the different features and components. So you're not trying to do everything to get it ready all at once. And I just like to share here this little quote, which I really like from this is my sort of go-to agile book, the Agile for Dummies. But it's important because this quote, I think, makes the point that on an agile project, you still do a lot of the stuff that you would do on a waterfall project. So, you need to understand what the requirements are. What does this thing have to do? You document what you're doing, etc., etc. But that little last bit at the end just sums it up, really. So instead of completing these steps for everything all at once, you break it into iterations. And so you can release parts of something in stages. And the benefit of that is you can get benefits more quickly. So rather than waiting for the whole thing to be done, and Elizabeth and I were just laughing actually about Zoom, weren't we, Elizabeth? Because we were saying how, we get used to a system and then suddenly a new little feature pops up. But the point with agile is that you can get financial benefits more quickly. So you're releasing something, you might not have everything, but it's starting to bring in benefits more quickly rather than waiting for everything to be ready all at once. And then that's when you bring in your benefits. And also, as many of you will know, agile is sort of born out of the world of IT. It's often used in IT systems development. And at PR Academy, we've just built a new learning platform, which I'm really, really pleased with it. And we did that in an agile way, although to be honest, we didn't employ lots of agile methodology. And frankly, it was a little bit of an excuse for not quite knowing what we wanted. And I think sometimes, one of the things about agile, it works well as a project method when the client, in this case this was us, wasn't 100% sure what they wanted. Having said that, we were still very clear about what we needed it to do, what our vision was, why we were doing it, all that kind of good stuff. That didn't really change. So that's the essential difference. And apologies, many of you might know this, but I thought, not sure what stages people are at. So I think it's worth just going back to basics. And also because sometimes, when we're supporting a project, we do need to understand how it's being run. That's really important because we need to match our comms approach to the structure of the project, the phases of the project, be they sort of waterfall phases or agile sprints, whatever it is, we need to be mapping our communications to those stages. So we do absolutely need to understand how this project is running. So how do we understand a project? This is something I talk about quite a bit in the book, actually, because it's something that I personally found can be quite daunting. And people working on projects, they really sort of be like embedded in the project, and it can be quite hard to actually get out of them what they're doing and why they're doing it sometimes. But So I think getting a good understanding of a project that we're asked to support, there are a few things that we can do here. And obviously project documentation, which sounds a bit dry, but it is really important. And sometimes as a comms person, I was often asked actually to get involved in preparing some of this stuff, particularly the business case. So that's probably where I would start, get your hands on the business case, because every project should have one. And this should outline kind of what you're doing, why you're doing it, what other options were looked at, and why you plumped for the one that you did. So that's a really good place to start. And just a note here about the business case. On a project that will generally be owned, not necessarily written, but owned by the project sponsor. Now, the project sponsor, I think, is another really important person to find out what's going on, but they're also a really important relationship, I think, for the communicator. So the project sponsor is somebody who isn't involved in the day-to-day running of the project, but they probably chair a project board or steering group, whatever's in place. But they can unlock budget, and from a comms perspective, they can sometimes unlock tricky stakeholders and give you guidance on, how something might sit with a group of stakeholders, etc. And the reason that they're able to do this and that they matter is because they have responsibility for that business case, and that means they're responsible for the benefits that are articulated in that business case. So if the business case says this project is going to make us 10 million quid by Christmas, it's on the sponsor to make sure that happens. So a really, really key role. And in fact, sometimes I don't think sponsors always quite get their role, and it's something the Association for Project Management do quite a lot around educating people about sponsorship. There might be a vision and blueprint which sets out what the organisation wants to achieve, what things are going to be like once the project's delivered. Sometimes there might be something called a project initiation document. You might be on a project running Prince 2, which has all manner of documentation and etc. for you to get to grips with. Another important thing I think for us to look at is the risks and issues register. Because this sometimes is, where we'll see things flagged up that could go wrong or are already a problem. And very often, comms might be listed as the mitigator of some of these issues. So we need to, to understand that process. We need to be part of it, I would argue, as well.
Thank you.
Also, what about lessons learned? Has the organisation done something like this before, and does it have a lessons learned log? Because this is, let's not reinvent the wheel. What worked for different stakeholders before, what didn't, what was learned. And by the same token, when we're running comms on our project, we should also be thinking lessons learned all the time. And this is where agile, I think, is really good. It's part of also sort of being a reflective practitioner. But even if your project has, very, ordinary sit-down project boards, project meetings, it's really, really good to embed lessons learned in those sessions, so it's an item on an agenda of the meeting each time, what's worked well, what hasn't, and documenting that. Also think about being in the right place and talking to the right people. So, we should be there on the project or program board. We should be involved in risks and issues. And if you are on a project that's running a change control process, then it's good to be part of that, because this is often where you'll get an early heads up of something that's going to be different and might impact on the messaging or, the stakeholder relationships that you're responsible for. And a couple of tips here, really, I think, when we do attend meetings and things, if sprints, whatever it is, let's ask the question, if a decision's made, what are the comms implications? Can we just stop? Let's just say, what are the comms implications here? Oh, well, it means this for this stakeholder. Who's going to tell them? Just very simple things like that, just getting people to think comms all the time. And being clear about, the stakeholder relationships. If you've got this person in your project who owns this stakeholder, are they going to tell them that this change has been made, or just this decision, etc., etc. And I know we're an internal comms group here, but we should always also be thinking external, because if we're working on a project, you often might discover things that could have external implications as well, and you might discover those before your colleagues in the press office or wherever it is. You know, if you're moving people from one building to another, is a for sale board going to go up? Because if I was a local journalist, I'd be straight on that. Where are those jobs going? And so, you know, always have that eye to the external. That's really important. And sometimes that can be quite political if it's jobs coming or going and that sort of thing. So you have to have a little bit of a political nous and radar as well. And I think even if any doubt, just ask your colleagues in the business who you know, whose expertise that is. So I would argue that project change comms is a bit different then to business as usual. And why is that the case? I've heard some people say, oh, you know, it's just comms. Well, I'd argue, no, it isn't actually, for a few reasons. If we're supporting a project, the project is all about milestones, deliverables, sprints, products, releases, whatever it is. And we need to map our comms onto that process, onto that plan. So it should be a project plan, there'll be a change management plan potentially, and we need to be part of that same picture. So we're not over here doing, you know, just doing what we do for the sake of it. We need to make sure that our comms strategy and plan is delivering for the project. And we need to be adapting that to the project methodology, you know, so that's why we really need to understand how the project is working and operating, and to think about where we come in with comms and how we map on to that picture. I don't think that needs to be difficult, you know, you can just probably map it out, you know, very, very simply on a whiteboard almost, but it's just making sure that our comms strategy and our comms plan touches in at the right points and, you know, is supporting those milestones and deliverables. But it's also the same. So we should still remember all the tools and techniques that we have in our toolbox for delivering good communication. Stakeholders, really, really key in projects. And on agile, you know, people will often say, well, it's the thing about agile, you know, we involve the stakeholders much more. You do, but there's still all these other stakeholders out here who aren't involved, and that's perhaps what we need to be thinking about. So it's easy to assume there's lots of stakeholder engagement and that's all done and dusted, but it won't, you know, the project won't be talking to everybody. So we need to be thinking about, you know, prioritizing our stakeholders. I just put up here the good old-fashioned power interest matrix. But actually, I think on a project, we need quite a complex grid, which also talks about who owns that stakeholder relationship, what touch points that stakeholder has had, etc. So it becomes a really good tracking grid document. So in my experience, there's nothing that annoys a stakeholder more than people from two different parts of the project talking to them about slightly different things on the same day, waste of their time and a waste of the project's time. I think also with stakeholders, this is sometimes where we can come up against change management a little bit, because often change management thinks that stakeholders are their responsibility and that their job is to go around and talk to stakeholders. And I'm not saying it isn't, but this is where it can get a bit confusing. So I think this is where having roles and responsibilities made really, really clear is really important. My view about change management is it's thinking much more broadly than just stakeholders. It's thinking about training, it's thinking about gap analysis, which we'll just look at in a second. So stakeholders, one of those sort of, you know, can be a bit messy. And this is why I think setting out who owns the different stakeholder relationships is really important. And even if as comms people, we're not a relationship owner, we should be ensuring that everybody is giving the same project message to stakeholders. So that's our role there, to support with good messaging and consistency. We should always also remember things like our SMART objectives. So, you know, we want our comms to be effective. And this is part of, I think, earning the respect of the project. So what really drives me mad is when comms is the last item on a project board agenda and everybody's like, oh, I've got to go, I've got to get my train because it's overrun, and like, hello, I'm here, you know. So so one of my rules is I always want, let's do an alphabetical order, let's put comms, you know, up the top. So that we've got to get people to take us seriously, and this is about coming to our projects with SMART objectives, you know, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, timed objectives, which support the project objectives, support the change management, and also then are measured. So we can come with data and evidence to show people what it is that comms is doing, and that's how we get taken much more seriously on a project. We're not just that soft, fluffy person who does the newsletter, and very often, you know, we haven't got time to even talk to you know, him or her because we're all going off for our trains. So in that regard, you know, change project and change comms is the same. We still bring the same tools, evidence, data to show what we're doing. And of course, I couldn't not share Kevin's Ruck's radar communication planning model. There are other planning models are available, but you know, again, I think this is part of getting the project to take us seriously, showing that we have, you know, we have a strategy, you know, we have a plan, and that's based on a model. And also, you know, if you've got a model, it does obviously prompt you to bring in evidence, do your measurement, and reflect and adjust as you go. So you know, this is what I mean, is that, you know, project and change comms, while it is different, it's also the same, because all this good stuff should still apply. So change then, what about the change itself? And this is something that I think it's just always worth remembering, that not all change is created equal, and it's really important that we understand the impact of the change. I've worked on big change projects that have cost millions, but when you go in to look at it, you think actually the change isn't huge and I could do this on 2 days a week. So it's really important that we understand the impact of any change. And this is where I think the change team come in. This is really the role of change management. We need to say, what's the current state, what's the future state, and then what's the gap, and how are we going to close it? And as I say, this, I would look to the change team to do this, but we should be asking for it. We should be, you know, we want to see this because we want to contribute to it as comms people. There are lots of models to help you do this. This is the McKinsey 7S model. I do love a good management consultancy model, how you can make everything begin with the same letter. But this is just basically, you know, I think, you know, this is a model that's out there, but all this is really doing is saying, you know, what are all the different things we need to think about? Skills, might we need new skills? You know, is this going to change our systems, etc.? And then thinking about, where are we now? Where do we need to be? And actually, sorry, I put change SAP, it should be change gap. You know, what's the difference between them? What are the issues and barriers to change? This is how this model works. And then what are we actually going to do in terms of change activities to close that gap? Obviously, an example of that would be, there's a new IT system, people don't know how to use it. We're going to do some training so they do know how to use it. But I think we should add comms in here as well. How is comms contributing to closing that gap between the current state and the future state? And this is where we're working really closely with the change comms guys, with the change management guys here. So just an example, you know, how are we going to know if we're ready? You know, this is something that the project, you know, particularly in the Waterfall environment, will want to know. Are we ready to launch this product? And that there could be a number of things that we need to be checking here. And some of them are for change and some of them are for us. So, for example, have people had training? Have we got enough people trained for this new system to roll out? Has the comms worked? And remember, I think the important point here is not just have we delivered the comms plan, has it worked? And this is why we need those smart outcome objectives on our comms plan to go, yep, not only have we delivered it, but we can show you through our measurement and evaluation that it's effective and people know what they have to do, they know about the change, and they're kind of cool with it. You might have a KPI about the number of stakeholders that have been met and talked to. And it's also worth knowing, does the project, you know, again, this will be a bit different on agile, but if it's a waterfall project, is there a no-go decision? Is there a point at which the project is going to say we're good to go, or no, we're not? And some of these are the sorts of things that might be taken into consideration, and we as comms people should be part of that and contributing to that decision. So what about doing change and comms on an agile project then? As I say, you know, a lot of things are the same, but some things are different. So some of the challenges when you've got an agile situation is the fact that the actual outcome, the thing that you're doing, doesn't really come to light immediately. You know, that happens in an iterative way. Now, I've worked on waterfall projects where that is the same as well. You don't quite know, and you have change control that means things change as you go. But the vision may be less clear, and they're harder to communicate. But I would argue, even with an agile project, you still do need a clear vision, and this is somewhere where we can jump in and help the project to articulate that. One of the big things, I think, is the organisation might not understand agile, and I think there's a real role here for us as communicators to help the organisation and stakeholders understand this is a slightly different way of working. We might be rolling something else and we haven't quite crossed all the T's, but this is, this is how we're doing it. Don't worry. This is the new way of delivering a change within the organisation. So there's something here about readiness for the organisation to embrace an agile project way of working. Agile can be really fast paced. So can all projects actually, but it just means that we might not have as much time for training and what have you as we would normally want, and the same can apply to communications. But I think we're generally, as comms people, we're quite good at adapting our comms plans on the hoof, because we kind of have to do that most of the time, don't we? No comms plan or strategy to sit in a drawer and and it's set in stone. The gap analysis can be harder. So, we talked about what's the future state going to be, and that's a little bit harder when you're not quite sure what that project is going to end up looking like. So there are some challenges. It is more fast paced, and this means we've got to be really sort of, talking to the right people and then at the right sessions. And I'm just going to share this quote, which I love. So this is from one of my favourite books around change management that we use on some of our courses, the Effective Change Manager's Handbook. We don't know if we'll plant barley, potatoes or cabbages, but we'll clear the ground and nourish the soil, so when we do know, we can get on with planting. And I think that kind of sums up the role of change and comms. Very often in an agile environment, we're doing the readiness, we're nurturing the soil and getting people ready. I think it's a big part of what we have to do. So just finally, before we sort of start going into some questions, just a couple of my change myths, which I always like to end up with. But something you often hear people saying on change is that we should communicate early and often. And I would just challenge that, because we should think about relevance. And we should be, comfortable in not communicating. I know that sounds counterintuitive, but one of my mantras is obviously to do less comms. Because if we're not careful, we start on this sort of premise that we have to communicate a lot, and we end up communicating for the sake of it. It's not relevant, it's not timely, and so our stakeholders and our audiences just switch off and then they never read anything else. But also we're creating noise in the organisation, so it's harder for our stakeholders to pick out the bits that really matter. And it's absolutely fine, and I have to say I learned this from a brilliant change manager I worked with once, and she said, it's fine, so we're going to go and brief them, and we're going to tell them we're not going to be back for 6 months, and then we'll come back in 6 months and we're going to take them through the change plan and comms plan. And I was a bit like, oh, but she was right. And they had that sense of confidence because we'd explained what we were doing, that we had like a SharePoint or websitey thing, and they could always ask questions meanwhile. But we were quite strict in saying we're not going to keep talking to you if we don't have anything to say. So sometimes it's okay not to communicate, and I think that's better than trying to do lots and lots of talking which isn't really relevant. What's in it for me is my other favourite, and again, it's a bit like soft skill. I will always pick people up on this if they say, well, we have to give people the what's in it for them. And no, we don't, because we're not selling the change. Selling change doesn't really work. It might do if it's something amazing, but a lot of the time there isn't anything in it for somebody, So what we should talk about is, what does it mean for me? What does it mean for them? What's in it for me implies that we have to sell the change. And I personally think also this is one of the biggest blockers for line managers when dealing with change, is that they feel their job is to sell the change to their team instead of facilitating a conversation, a dialogue, and listening to them about the change. So two of my top change myths: early and often, and what's in it for me. Don't like them. Again, I'd be interested to hear what you think about that. So just one final thought. I would say that communication has always been agile. I would say, we're good at this stuff. We're good at being fleet of foot. And if we've been doing our change planning properly, and I've taken this from the Association for Measurement and Evaluation of Communications, AMEC, this is part of their measurement framework, which actually I think is a whole planning thing and is really, really good. And all good planning models will be telling you to decide what you're going to do, check and adapt, check and adapt, check and adapt. We've always been told through good planning models for PR and comms, that's what we should be doing. So I think we've always been quite agile, and we're pretty well placed to work in an agile environment. There we are. I think that's left us just a little plug for PR Academy at the end. On our website, pracademy.co.uk, there's an Insights, which is our PR Place blog. We've got lots of guides on there. There's a guide to change management, guide to communication strategy, guide to change, as I say. So do go and check it out and have a little delve around in there, and you're very welcome to download anything that might be of use. There we are.
Brilliant, fantastic, Anne. There was so much great stuff there, and so many great tools and tips. And I think as well, sort of the Kevin Rook's radar model is still my go-to strategy model.
Oh, don't! I'll tell him. Then he won't be able to get his head through the door. Don't say that.
Absolutely must. Sort of thing, and it is true. Sort of like the amount of times I've used it as my reason for not going straight to comms, of saying sort of like you've gone straight to the D, but we need to do the research and the assessment first of all. So yeah, so fantastic. We've started to be some questions come in, so let me just go back to the top. We've got some praise coming as well. Josephine had said that she's done the internal comms specialist diploma with PR Academy, and it was an excellent course.
Oh, thank you, Josephine. You're with Kevin then.
Fantastic. And then on the comms is not a soft skill, Rosaline says she can't agree more, sort of thing. I think it's true, sort of like it does start to devalue let me just admit down in, it starts to devalue the comms. And there was a hard agree from Claire as well.
Yeah, and I think this is where, using planning models, using evidence, research to inform what we do, measuring smart objectives and reporting back. And I think I have another little rule, which I'll just share. It's my 80-20 rule. And Anne's 80-20 rule is that we should spend 80% of our time doing our job and 20% of our time telling people we're doing our job. And I don't mean showing off. I mean reporting data evidence about what we've achieved, and that's really, and that's when people start to listen up and take us more seriously.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've seen that in practice as well, because a lot of times projects don't see what you're doing, and they'll maybe just see the visibility of a channel, but whereas all the actual stakeholder work and all the other great work sometimes goes invisible. So yeah, absolutely, that's a good shout. And Tamina has also said that they've been on the specialist diploma course and loved the new learning platform too.
Hi, Tamina.
So good shouts out there. And then Tom had added, that's a great slide. So in my notes, that was the one around how to understand a project, and I agree. I think that was a great slide. I think often as internal comms people, we were kind of thrown in at the deep end, and we were thinking, what do these initials stand for? So I think that was a great slide. And then let's see where we are. So we're down to some questions. So Binu has asked, from a skills POV, project management is project management the same as project communications? Is it important to become certified in project management /comms to be taken seriously?
That's a really good question, Binu. I mean, I actually did go and get qualified in project management, but I'm a bit geeky like that. I would say not. I mean, I think if it interests you, go for it, because, as I say, this isn't just really about supporting projects with communication. There's an awful lot that we can apply to make our own work more effective. We can borrow skills, etc., from project management for our own work. And they do have, in fact, we used to run it, we don't anymore, but there is a fundamentals. So the Association for Project Management has a fundamentals qualification, which is an introductory. And I think that's great. I mean, it just covers all the bases. So I think if it interests you, absolutely go for it. But really, I think this is about, here we have project management, we have change management, we have comms. We're all professionals with our own bodies of knowledge. We're all sort of like got chartered bodies, and we should, respect each other's space, if you like, and all kind of work together. So having said that, go for it. I did it. I really, really enjoyed it and got a lot out of it. But you know, you shouldn't have to do it, because we should be being taken seriously on a project based on our own models, theories, etc.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good shout, isn't it? So thank you, Bino, for that question. And we've got one from Rosaline. So does Agile have to have a different description or equivalent of the go, no go gateway? So in Waterfall, we always, that tense moment, or does it get the final approval? So within Agile, what was the equivalent?
I'm not sure if you'd have the equivalent decision. I mean, Elizabeth, you might know that better than me, what you would call it. But obviously, at some point, you're going to have to decide if it's, you know, if you're safe to let it loose on the world, aren't you?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Because I think from the Agile projects I've done, it's you're working in sprints, and so the sprint, does it get to that proof of concept stage? And so you work in these really short bursts of sprints. But when I read this question earlier, I was trying to think what the go no gateway piece was. But
it's quite hard to say, isn't it?
Yeah, it's, I think a lot of times it's because it's they use this little analogy, and you start off with a skateboard. So once you've got the skateboard up and running, you're then building towards having that car at the end. So sort of like, and you've got that as once you've got your minimal viable product up and running. So yeah, let me have I'll go back and look at that one, Rosalie, and then sort of and drop you a little note. Sort of thing. So, but I think that's where the differences are. You're not waiting on that final goal. You're already in flight as well.
Exactly. No, that's exactly it. And I think this is a good example of where, you know, you almost have to ask the project actually, but it's not the same, you know, on that kind of waterfall project. It all does. You know, you're doing all of it at the same time, ready for that one big launch. Then you have to decide, are you ready to go or not? Whereas with Agile, you know, you might have just done this bit of it, and you know, you'll go when you're ready, and etc. So yeah, I wouldn't say there was the absolute equivalent, because the methodologies are different. But I think this is where, you know, this is about you know, saying to the project, you know, what's at what point do you decide that you're going to, you know, let it loose on the world? But as Elizabeth said, you know, it is kind of already out there. Yeah,
fantastic. Thanks, Rosaline. And then with a couple of direct messages. So we have recorded the session, so we will send out, there's a few people who joined a little bit later, so we can absolutely send out the link.
I can send the slides, Elizabeth, as well, if that'd be helpful. Amazing. If you want the slides, that
would be super helpful. Then we can send the slides and the recording link out as well. That'd be brilliant. And then Peter said less is more, quality over quantity. So I think that's when we were talking about the not communicating too early.
And do less comms.
Yeah. And
I think just I'd add something on there, if that's all right. I mean, I think one of the other things that we need to get really good at is really establishing if the problem is a comms problem, because I've very often find somebody, you know,
sorry, we just lost Anne for a minute there. Hold on 2 seconds. There we go, back again.
I thought I was being really boring and somebody had muted me. I thought, was I that boring?
Never, Anne, never.
But I can't remember what I was going to say now. Brain's gone. Yeah, so I think sometimes as well, we get asked to fix things that aren't fixable with communication. And I've had this scenario. Somebody says, oh, you know, this is happening. And I get, and you do that kind of questioning. Okay, so just, okay, yeah, we could do a video or whatever, but let's just question. And actually what you find out through some, you know, gentle questioning is the problem's not fixable through communication. And then that again is a piece of comms you don't have to do, but actually what you've done is added immense value for the project, because you actually help them to identify the core problem instead of creating lots of noise. So again, it comes back to my mantra of sometimes just doing less comms, and then you get to go home a bit earlier, which is always good in my book.
Absolutely. And it's such a good point, asking those questions, because the comms is the more visible bit of the project. So sort of a bit like in internal comms, people just always want sort of like put it on the internet, and so you get those same requests of people want to visibly the project to be seen to be doing stuff, but actually absolutely, it's the ego of the project managers, and sort of like, and just being wanting to be visible rather than actually, is it the right thing and is it the right time? So asking those questions will always benefit. So we've got So Fee has messaged to say, I'm supporting a project at the moment where the vision and outcome is really unclear, but the project team are keen to be communicating. It often means that opinions have moved on once the communications are ready. How do you help draw out the future state? Well, that's a good question, Fee.
Gosh, it is. Oh, crikey. I suppose, I mean, this comes back to the project management piece a bit, doesn't it? I'm not sure what the project's doing, but I suppose this comes back to my point that sometimes why we struggle on comms is because the project is not in the best shape. So I think, you know, this is going right back to the project, and perhaps being the person who drives them to be clear about that vision rather than you know, waiting for them to tell us what the vision is, be sort of right in there and helping them to articulate the vision together. And really, you know, they shouldn't just be changing their minds as they go along. And opinions are one thing, but opinions aren't the project. So I think, I think, and also, again, I might say when you've got any problem like this, sometimes it's about evidence. So they might not listen to me, but if you talk to some stakeholders and do a little bit of research, or, you know, do you think the vision's clear? And the stakeholder goes, no, it's rubbish. You take that evidence back to the project. So it becomes an evidence kind of based conversation that might make them think, oh God, you know, we really are getting the stakeholders, you know, we're really, pardon my language, of peeing them off. We don't want to do that, but so you're bringing some kind of evidence. It's not you just saying it. I think that's often a way to tackle these things as well. It's kind of, you know, show them the evidence.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as well, it's how you're then tabling that with projects so that if it what is opinion and what's the facts, and who's your ultimate sign off as well, because sometimes in the middle layer of projects you'll get people whose opinions come out stronger, but actually when you go back to the original documentation, that's not really the direction of the project. So it's just building all that knowledge as well.
And maybe it's somewhere where the sponsor could help as well. I'm a great believer in using your sponsor as a comms person. You know, if you might have to go and say, look, this is just becoming a nightmare, can you help me sort it out? You know, if you've got a good relationship with your sponsor, that can be really valuable as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've had a couple of people who have had to drop off, but I've said great presentation. And Josephine said that it's been really insightful, so that's great to hear. Oh, that's a lovely one. So much appreciated. The content is exactly what I needed. Fantastic. So I think that's really great. So could you just whiz back to the getting involved slide? So that's a message from Charlotte's asked if we can go back to the getting involved slide.
Is it this one?
Yeah, it must be that one. Charlotte, did you have a particular question on the getting involved slide? If you want to, it might be easier to come off mute. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, it wasn't a question. I just was scribbling down the quote marks text and didn't quite grab it all. So that's fine. I'll grab it right now and then you can move on. Thank you.
Oh, cool. Brilliant. Thank you. Now, I think this is really important to get to know your project and understand where you need to stick, you know, go in with your pointy elbow and be part of the conversation, and also, you know, that little tip about just always saying when a decision's made is just like, can we just pause a minute and think about the comms implications, and then, you know, who's gonna, it might just be a simple conversation with a stakeholder who's going to tell, you know, just comms embedded in what's going on, rather than just that last agenda item when everybody's rushing for the train. Yeah. But actually, we're going to tell them not to put us last on the agenda, aren't we? So that won't happen anymore.
I know. I love that alphabetical order agenda item. That if you take nothing away from today, then that's brilliant.
Yeah, that's one of my top tips. Do not have comms as the last item. It drives me nuts. It should be the first item. But actually, you know, embed it as you go. So each agenda item should almost wrap up with, are there any comms implications out of that? And then it gets people thinking, you know, plan, you know.
Fantastic. So Alan's asked, great insight on change communications. What's the difference between change and project comms?
So I think this is a really good question, Alan, and I think there is a clear difference, and it won't always be the same everywhere. But I think for me, change is that piece that's saying, you know, where are we now? What's the future state? How do we need to get there? Doing that gap analysis. I think that's the role of change management. Doing the impact analysis, and this is so important because, you know, something might be costing the organisation a fortune, but the change might not be great, but they might be doing something really tiny that everybody's kind of like, oh, that's just a little project over there, but the implications are huge. So the change impact is really important. So I think those are roles for change management. Personally, myself, that's my view about it. And then things like, you know, training, all those things that are going to close that gap where we talk about change management. But of course, comms is a big part of closing that gap as well. And I think, as I say, sometimes, you know, there's a bit of an overlap between, you know, stakeholder relationships. Is that, you know, is that the project folk who are doing it? Is it the change folk who are doing it? What's the role for comms? So sometimes those lines can be a little bit blurred.
Absolutely, and that's where your RACI comes in, because a lot of times you'll have your HR team there, you'll have your change people, and you'll have your comms people, and your overlapping pieces, engagement and people, and so it's then understanding right from the outset so that you avoid those bun fights further down the line. So Charlotte says, I work on agile projects. We have lots of go no goes.
Right, okay, there you go. Yeah, you have lots of them. Yeah.
Yeah, sort of thing. And then it links into Rosalind's question as well about what makes it safe, less on terminology, more on what makes it a safe change to make, the assurance piece. In the last agile project I worked on, everything went through the CAB, so the change approval board. So there will probably, and I think different organizations do it differently, don't they? So you'll have some traditional waterfall things around it, but whereas depending on what the thing is, so you'll have your change readiness, and also you might have some decision boards that are the ultimate go no go on agile. So let's see what else. We're down to our last 5 minutes, so let's see what else we've got here. So so lovely to see you again, Anne. This is from Edu V.
Hello, Dewey.
So please, I don't think I've said that name properly. And he's looking forward to the slides and the recording. And so true on fixing things with comms. That's my week so far. Yeah, I think that's my week so far too.
Yeah, it just happens, you know, and I think the thing is, just to sort of quickly say here as well, I think because we always do want to help, don't we? And we want to do comms, that's why we're in the jobs that we do. But I think sometimes you have to shift that mindset and say, actually, also we are problem identifiers, and that brings, you know, it might be something you can do in 5 minutes with a conversation, and I often use this to get out of running events. When I was doing projects, I hate running events, so somebody would say we need a team of, I'm like, oh god, no. So you know, once you have a conversation about why they think that, you actually find in all seriousness that that's never going to fix it. So what you've done is identified the real problem and saved the organisation a lot of money, and I don't have to run an event, so I'm very happy. But there's value in it. I think the thing is, our value as really good strategic comms people isn't just in doing comms, it's also some of this other stuff, problem identification and helping the organisation, the project identify, you know, the real issue. It's really valuable.
Brilliant, thank you. And we've had another helpful session from Fee, so people starting to drop off. And so I'll pick up the last couple of questions. Bina had done a quick search on Google, and there was 2 different results for the PMI org and the Institute of Project Management. So I suppose it's just from that, which one is the industry standard for project management?
Yeah, so in the UK, we have the Association for Project Management, and that's a chartered body. The PMI is the American outfit, so they're sort of similar kind of organisation, but more US based. So my sort of experience and allegiance, if you like, is to the Association for Project Management, and so I don't think there's any sort of right or wrong really, but I quite like to work with the APM people. They're chartered, they're UK based, and just lovely people. But yes, you've got to, a bit like, you know, with the CIPR, you've also got the PRCA. Sometimes you do have more than one body looking after an area of a profession, don't you?
Fantastic. Well, thank you everybody for your questions. So we've got 3 books to give away as well. So I'll do a traditional draw names out of the hat this afternoon, and we'll let the people know who are going to be the proud winners of the book, and then we'll share on socials as well to let people know the winners. So thank you so much, Anne. I think Dan was going to come off mute as our chair and just wrap up the session for us.
Apologies for joining late, sadly a double booking, but thank you firstly to Anne for offering to join us. It's been a very popular session, both from sign-ups and just seeing the questions. So, you know, really great. So thank you so much, Anne, for taking some time out to join us. And then also thank you to Elizabeth from the committee, you know, who gives up, again, spare time to do these events. So to both of you, thank you on behalf of everyone who's here. Like Elizabeth said, we will send out in the next couple of days a link to the recording, and Anne's, I think, picked up there about the slides as well. So we provide that. But thank you all so much for joining. Tomorrow, if you're members, you'll see this in progress within your CPD, so you can log your 5 points for attending. But you know, really appreciate your time. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks for inviting me. I've really enjoyed it. Lovely to see some familiar names and faces. And Elizabeth, I think we're a really good double act. What does everybody else think?
We'll book you for next month, I think, by the sounds of it.
I know. I think we should go on the road, Anne. I think we've got this.
Come up to mine.
I know. It's sort of like I will. Thanks everybody. Thanks everybody for all the great questions.
And it's lovely to see some members from outside the UK as well.
Yeah,
so,
brilliant.
Far
really
and wide,
lovely.
which is great.
Fantastic.
Thanks everybody.
Bye.
Bye.